everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. Now, ask anybody what they feel about the Lord of the Rings movies. They will either praise them for being part of one of the greatest trilogies of all time, or they will dismiss them as overrated due to the long running time and the fact that the films just bored them. Sort of like how 2001: A Space Odyssey bores me. Well, I have a very unique stance when it comes to these films because I love The Fellowship of the Ring. It is one of my favorite movies of all time. I try to watch it at least once a year. I think I saw it like 3 times while it was still playing in theaters. But I've always been very indifferent to the sequels, The Two Towers and Return of the King. It's not that I believe they're technically inferior, and this always confused me because I liked the books about the same. But The Fellowship was a movie that I was in love with, whereas I respected and kind of liked The Two Towers and Return of the King, but otherwise I think I only have seen them twice in my entire life. The reason why I bring this up is that it actually ties into my feelings towards The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, where if you ask anybody about that, everybody universally agrees that it is the weakest of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings franchise. But then are split as to whether it's still a good movie or whether it has descended into bad movie territory. Well, once again, my beliefs on this film are rather odd because I agree that it is the weakest of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films, but I actually prefer it more than The Two Towers and Return of the King. It is definitely the most flawed, keep that in mind. But the reason why I like it so much is it brings back what I loved about The Fellowship of the Ring. I love that it focuses on a small group of people, whereas The Two Towers and Return of the King breaks the group up where they interact with more characters, and because there isn't as much time to explore these characters as the book had, all of the characters they interact with end up being boring, whereas I was always just interested in the original group. But The Fellowship of the Ring primarily focuses on this small group, and we follow them throughout the entire movie, more or less. And The Hobbit's the same way. It's just focusing on Bilbo and the dwarves and Gandalf as they explore this amazing world. And that's another thing that I liked, is Middle-earth feels more like Middle-earth in The Fellowship of the Ring and The Hobbit. Whereas with The Two Towers and The Return of the King, I felt like I was in New Zealand, where they just happened to build some sets upon. There's a reason for this. The Fellowship and The Hobbit focus more on the exotic locations, like Rivendell, where the elves live, and the Shire, where the hobbits live, and that's a surprisingly cool set in itself. Then the Dwarvish Kingdom, and it seems like all the little places in between, they're focusing on the more bizarre races, I guess, whereas The Two Towers and Return of the King, you get more of the human world. And because the human world seems more grounded in reality, it's just kind of boring in comparison to these more mystical locations. So that is one of the major reasons why I prefer The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Ring. And just kind of expanding on that, The Hobbit I thought was great visually. In fact, if the story isn't as epic as what we got in Lord of the Rings, visually I'd say it surpasses it. Now, there's a lot more CGI used, and that really concerned me because I am one of those people who just... I prefer practical effects and actual real sets over computer-generated effects. But this, I think it worked because everything blended together very seamlessly. One of the faults of the original trilogy, including The Fellowship, is that the sets looked so great that sometimes the CGI effects that were placed in there, it just drew too much attention to the fact that it was CGI. And this is actually even more glaring whenever the live-action characters would interact with the CGI effects, because it would look really awkward. But to be fair, that is one of the major flaws of CGI in general. But not here. I thought the actors interacted with the computer-generated effects perfectly to where I never even really saw all the special effects as CGI, even though that's obviously what it was. And I guess I should point out that there's been a lot of controversy surrounding the 47 frames per second thing. I'm not very familiar when it comes to the technical aspects of a shoot, but from what I gathered, it's supposed to remove motion blur, but in the process, a lot of people felt that it made the special effects seem phonier. I did not catch on to any of that. The only part where I felt the special effects looked too much like special effects was during a few shots with the eagles at the end. I felt like I was watching a video game in some parts. But I should point out, though, that I am not very good when it comes to catching flimsy special effects. I just recently learned that my eyesight is deteriorating, so It makes me wonder how many times I'll see a movie with weak special effects, or not even just like full-blown bad special effects, but, well, flimsy, stuff that if you actually look at it in the right way, you can definitely tell it's CGI or whatever. But how many times I may have just overlooked that for that reason. Usually I'll catch upon subsequent viewing, like I remember being impressed with the CGI in Skyline. Then I saw it again later on and I noticed more faults to it. And then The Last Airbender especially, God, how did I overlook that? And I didn't even think those special effects were particularly good when I did see it, but when I saw it again I noticed a lot more flaws there. So this might be the same case. I might watch The Hobbit again and realize, man, the special effects are really cheesy, or they just don't look quite right. Was I just too caught in the moment? Maybe. You have to make that decision for yourself when you do see the movie, or unless you have already seen it and made up your mind there. The 3D wasn't necessary. It's not horrible. It didn't take away from the enjoyment, but for the most part, I didn't even notice I was watching a 3D movie. Every once in a while, it would add depth to the visuals, or it'll have some that will fly at the screen. In fact, one thing I will give this movie credit for in terms of its 3D, this is one of the only 3D experiences where I actually flinched. And that's when they throw a flaming pine cone and it sort of bounces off the ground and into the camera. That actually made me go, oh shit, I fell for that. But otherwise, I didn't notice it. I'd only say pay for it if you're rich and you have nothing else better to do. Otherwise, I didn't think it was worth the extra $3. But one thing too with the visuals I thought really stood out is the goblins and orcs. They were much more animated this time around, whereas in the previous trilogy they just kind of felt like one-dimensional beasts, I guess, that were only designed to kill and fight. But here they show a lot more personality. The trolls were hilarious. The fat-ass goblin I thought was really cool. The main villain orc I thought was kind of generic, but in terms of design I thought that was pretty interesting. But it made you really felt like these were actual races now, whereas before you just saw them as tools, I guess, for the villain. So I guess that's really all I have to say about the visuals. Just the locations looked amazing, and I had no problems with the CGI. Everything blended together very seamlessly, probably because it was all digital. But also one of the things that I thought made The Fellowship and The Hobbit superior to The Two Towers and The Return of the King, or at least what I preferred about them, is they genre bended real masterfully. The fact that it's focusing on a small group of people really heightens the tension when they find themselves in hardcore situations, whether they're surrounded by orcs, goblins, whatever. Whereas you just don't get that same effect when you're dealing with armies clashing, and that's what The Two Towers and Return of the King really emphasized. Large-scale battles, whereas that's just not as interesting as watching a small group experience all these different obstacles. This is the part where I usually get stuck on how to describe. Like, what will be, you'll start with these characters, then it will be funny. The movie's kind of shifted into a more lighthearted, comical tone. And then it'll be kind of scary and creepy. And it usually works. In fact, I'd say The Hobbit is creepier than most horror films, even though it's not really a horror film. And I've always been really confused at how most horror movies fuck that up. And then, of course, we'll have a lot of action. And I thought the action scenes were really well choreographed, although I wouldn't say I was invested in them as much as before. But I'll explain why hopefully later if I don't forget. And then it will go back into more adventure mode where you're just, enamored with these locations and stuff like that. And then it'll become a tear-jerking drama, or it'll become very heartwarming. And, it goes through all these phases so wonderfully that it never really betrays the tone, and just it makes the experience that much more complete. I felt like I've seen every kind of movie within this one movie, and it was more than satisfying. But now let's move to the problems. This is one of the major issues I had with the book. The dwarves just don't have distinct personalities. They work as a whole in terms of keeping my interest, but as individuals, nothing about them really stands out. And the movie doesn't really help that either. Sure, their designs are pretty over the top, so you could tell them apart in terms of that, but I couldn't name any of them except Thorin, and in terms of personality, I can't say anything about them. Thorin himself is kind of a flat character. He's not boring, but they're trying to do what they did with Aragorn and Boromir, but it just doesn't work as well, so he didn't really do anything for me. I liked how, I think his name's Martin Freeman, played Bilbo. He made that character very endearing and likable, but at the same time, the movie doesn't always know what to do with Bilbo. His character development is very rushed and half-assed. I never bought any of his major moments. With Frodo, maybe it's because there was more time spent with him. I understood why he made all the decisions he did, and you could see him grow on screen. With Bilbo, like, one moment he's adamantly against going on this journey, then suddenly he changes his mind, and I never really saw where he made that jump. Or there's one scene that I thought was kind of forced, when he's saying why he's going to stick with them because he has a home to go to, they don't. Well, that just, once again, kind of came out of nowhere, and I just didn't buy that. And I think the problem is, too, Frodo just had a much more interesting journey, whereas Bilbo's feels very small scale in comparison. But, I like the actor enough to where I could, I guess, forgive that. But where we do come to the major problems is the stuff I believe Peter Jackson changed. It's been so long since I read the book, I could be making a huge mistake here and come across like a complete ass. So if I'm wrong, ignore this part. But they add a lot more stuff involving Sauron, and I don't remember Sauron playing any kind of role in the book. Here they just refer to him as the Necromancer, and it sounds like an interesting idea, but it actually screws everything up because The Hobbit is very episodic in structure. It's less about them and their quest to slay the dragon as much as it's the obstacles that get in their way before they could even reach that location. So they come across these trolls, and it adds really nothing to the story. The trolls have no tie-in with the dragon or the kingdom that they're trying to get to. It's just they happen to be there, and the dwarves unfortunately now have to deal with them. And then they run into goblins the same way. And that's okay, because I've always felt with this kind of spectacle, it is more about... usually these types of adventures do work better as episodic features. But when they add this stuff with Sauron, what that does is it creates an overarching plot. And it makes all these scenes that are meant to, the episodic aspects, such as the trolls and the goblins, seem like pointless filler because they don't work for Sauron. And furthermore, this story involving the Necromancer, it is actually really interesting in itself, but the characters themselves never really interact with that subplot. So it just draws so much attention to how flimsy the narrative is, because what was supposed to be episodic now feels like pointless filler, and they aren't even getting to the more interesting story yet. And hopefully they'll tie that in better, in the second or third film. But I am not reviewing The Hobbit as a trilogy. I am reviewing this movie as an individual movie, nothing more. So I thought that just really screwed things up. It really fattened up the running time. The pacing was really awkward. Now, with The Two Towers and Return of the King, they ran out of steam during the third act, I felt. But this one, it seems to go back and forth to where, like, during the middle section of the movie, I was kind of getting bored and getting impatient, wishing for the movie to hurry up. They'd have all these scenes that presumably tie into the Lord of the Rings story, which didn't feel necessary. In fact, I was actually looking forward to seeing a smaller trilogy, maybe one that wouldn't be as long, because I just find Middle-earth so interesting that it didn't need to be as epic as Lord of the Rings. But when you bring in all these Lord of the Rings tie-ins, that just forces us to make comparisons. I wasn't going to do that originally. Originally, I was just going to treat The Hobbit as its own trilogy, but now with all these allusions to the Lord of the Rings movies, I can't help it, and it makes The Hobbit seem so insignificant in general. When you deal with stuff with, the whole thing with Sauron that's going to envelop all of Middle-earth. So this quest about these dwarves trying to reclaim their kingdom from a dragon seems so weak in comparison, but that's not how the book was, if I'm remembering it correctly. The book was just about their quest. It didn't try to be this whole issue that's going to affect the entire world. All of the ending sort of does, but not to the extent that it affected the Lord of the Rings, or the Lord of the Rings affected the world. So that's why I believe the Hobbit is the most flawed. There's very little I could say about the Two Towers from Return of the King in terms of objective criticism. I can't really point out so much wrong with those. They didn't really leave that much of an impact on me. The Hobbit left a bigger impact on me, but it does have more objective flaws. So hopefully I explained my points clearly. This was a very difficult episode to do. And I'll wrap it up here. Would I recommend it? Yes, if you liked the Lord of the Rings movies. Just don't expect it to be as good. Would I recommend as a full price? It's up to you. 3D, same thing. If you want to spend that much more money for it, go ahead. I won't stop you. There's the worse movies you could do that for. And if you didn't like the Lord of the Rings movies, I wouldn't bother. And if you were indifferent to those, at the most a rental, but even then I don't think you'll like it. More than likely you'll believe that this is the worst of those films. If you'd like to read my written review, please check the link in my description. Be sure to follow me on Twitter. I'm about to do a written review of Don't Answer the Phone, the only movie I've seen that, as of late, that was practically a rape comedy. That was really weird, but that's all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you guys later. My stupid cat wants to get in the room.